This is OKFM 99.5. We're transmitting from Lynch Street here in Monrovia. You know, we never lied to you before. If we don't have our hands on something, we don't tell you that. Thanks to the U.S. Embassy for the continued cooperation in helping us make our job easier. Probably if you were responding to text messages about questions and about particular issues, they're always helping us. Today we have two officials of the U.S. Embassy accredited near our computer. They will introduce themselves, and we are focusing our discussion today on something very important. Few weeks ago, the United States government, through its Treasury Department, sanctioned 3 former Liberian government officials. Former Minister of State Nathaniel Fallon McGill, former Managing Director of the National Ports Authority, Bill Tuari, and the former Solicitor General of Liberia, Councillor Sieban Serena Cephas, for reasons associated with corruption. They use something called the U.S. Treasury Department used something called the Global Magnitsky Act. A lot of us, some of us, heard that name for the very first time, the Global Magnitsky Act. There are multidimensional discussions amongst Liberians at street corners and intellectual centers about the Global Magnitsky Act and what it is. So we decided to reach out to the U.S. Embassy through its public affairs section to allow some American officials through the embassy here to come on this radio and explain to the Liberian nation and people about what the Global Magnitsky Act is. And so we have two distinguished officials from the embassy. They will introduce themselves, and the entire discussion will center on the Global Magnitsky Act. I hope at the end of the day they would have helped us solve some of the questions in our mind. Good morning to the both of you, and let's begin with you. Just introduce yourself.
Good morning, Clarence. It's great to be here today. My name is Boda. I'm the Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Monrovia, and part of the Public Affairs section, as you mentioned. And it's a pleasure to be able to come on the show today to speak about this important issue, hopefully clear up any questions, make sure to dispel misinformation about what these designations mean, and explain a little bit more about the history and the reasons behind the Global Magnitsky Act. So thanks again for inviting us on. I'm very, very pleased to be here today, and also joined by my distinguished colleague. I'll turn it over to Kemper.
Yeah, good morning, Clarence. Thanks for having us. My name's Kemper Wagner. I work in the political section at the embassy. I've been here for about a year now in Liberia. And looking forward to answering questions and having a good dialogue today about Global Magnitsky and just in general the U.S. strategy on countering corruption. Is that's a new initiative by our government, just undertaken last year.
Okay. You want to draw closer to them? Okay, that's okay. And Shane, let me publicly say thanks to the U.S. government, thanks to the U.S. Embassy, and particularly to the Public Affairs section. You've been very cooperative. Every time we wrote you about inquiry on something particularly, because we believe this is one way we too can help our people get rid of the myth and the misinformation. So publicly, on behalf of the management of OKFM, let me say thank you for always responding to our concerns through the different inquiries. Thank you so much.
Clarence, thank you. And I want to just make a point on that, which is it's extremely important. We believe firmly in the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. We think that the media and freedom of the press is a fundamental element of any democracy. Obviously, we believe that firmly in the United States, and we support journalists, we support independent media, and journalism overseas as well. And we think that it is our role to be responsive. And, you know, sometimes as the public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy, it's almost dual-rolled because we do a lot of programs where we're supporting journalists and media, of course, in their work and professionalism. At the same time, we are speaking on behalf of the U.S. government and on behalf of the embassy in the country, and so we strive to be as responsive as possible when we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's true, yes, you've done it for a lot of Liberians. As a matter of fact, Denise Nipson, one of our colleagues, I think she's in the States this year on the prestigious Elo Aramorum program for journalists. Yes, I'm very sure of that, and I'm a 2015 fellow. You know, yes, I benefited 2 distinguished fellowship from the U.S. government. Spent a lot of money on me. You know, I was part of the El Aramorum program in 2015. Came back to the country. 2016, the U.S. government sent me back this time to do campaign management and political communication as an international campaign fellow at the University of Akron in Ohio, at the Ray C. Blay Institute of Applied Politics. So I'm a beneficiary of the U.S. government and its many opportunities, and I'm always proud to say that wherever I went. Thank you so much.
And as a native of Ohio, I'm especially
oh, you're from Ohio.
Happy. That's right.
I've been there, man. I was in Cleveland, as a matter of fact, but it's good. Let's move on.
Please.
Now, what's the function of the public affairs section at the U.S. Embassy?
Yeah, great question. So, as you mentioned, we are in charge of our various exchange programs, and we strive to send various Liberians from all walks of life on opportunities to study, to meet counterparts in the United States, and it's all about gaining experience. An exchange, of course, is not a one-way street. So, for instance, when you went to the United States, of course, that was, I hope, an incredible opportunity, but also the people that you traveled with and the Americans that you interacted with learned from you as well.
Yeah.
So people from around the world coming together on various topics, including on journalism, they learn from each other, they gain things together. So that's the purpose of our exchange programs. And we have some that are for youth. For instance, we send students to study for a year in the United States at the high school level through the YES program. We also have the Mandela Washington program, where each year we send more than a dozen. This year we sent 18 young, up-and-coming Liberians on a 6-week exchange to various universities to gain professional experience through the Mandela Washington Fellowship. And then the program that you mentioned, it's, of course, we focus on journalists, but we also focus on a lot of other professionals through our International Visitors Leadership Program, a very, very prestigious program where in an intense 3-week exchange, they are interacting with counterparts, learning from professionals, and they often are traveling with people from all over the world. And so, as a public affairs officer, I oversee those programs. At the same time, I work with the media and answer questions and try to explain U.S. policy in Liberia, and whatever that may be, whatever questions may come up. And of course, we are always looking to strengthen this bilateral relationship that now in 200 years of history, shared history together, it's a proud moment to be able to talk about that shared history.
Thank you, Chen. And through the course of the interview, I will try to be as simple as possible in my own Liberian context so that the least person listening to the radio this morning will be able to grab something. Now, what is the Global Magnitsky Act and how did it come to be?
Great question. Let me turn it over to Kemper to talk a little bit about the history of this important act.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's something that Global Magnitsky, obviously it's been in the news here. I think if you look at a lot of countries, the term global Magnitsky may not be that common, but actually in Liberia, I think the average Liberian may actually have a little bit of familiarity. At least they've heard maybe the term global Magnitsky, but I think it is really important to get the facts straight and know kind of what is it, where did it come from, and you know, it started with a person, and I think you have to realize that you know, Magnitsky was a real person. His name was Sergei Magnitsky. He was actually a Ukrainian individual who was a tax auditor working in Russia, and he was basically detained and tortured, and he was unfortunately died in detention because he had unearthed a lot of corrupt acts from Russian officials, and this was back in 2009. So it's been more than a decade since his death, and his death really spurred action, you know, around the world, not just in the U.S. So just realize that there are other governments, other like-minded democracies that have taken similar actions and approved legislation to combat corruption based on what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. You know, it's countries like the UK, Australia, other European allies, Canada. But in the U.S., basically the history of our act, it basically started in 2012. That's when the Magnitsky Act was passed. That was under the Obama administration.
2012.
2012, so 10 years ago, exactly. And you know, it was signed into law. It was really originally targeted, Magnitsky Act was targeted at Russian officials that were involved in basically human rights violations and corrupt acts. What was interesting was Congress, along with the Trump administration in 2016, then turned that into a global Magnitsky Act, which took what basically was being applied to Russian officials and said, we can expand this out and apply this globally now to fight corruption and to fight basically human rights violators around the world. So, you know, it's interesting how this legislation.
When was that? When did it get extended or expanded?
Yeah, so it got expanded in 2017.
2017.
Exactly. So that was, again, it was another administration. It got expanded, and now we're, you know, in 2022, and we have the Biden administration, who also is clearly a big proponent of this act, a big proponent of combating corruption. So we've seen it, you know, it still is relatively new, but it's also had a lot of basically it's had support, you know, from several administrations, whether it was one side of the aisle or the other. We've seen a lot of support just for this, because we realize, I think in the greater scheme of things, fighting corruption is a national security interest. I mean, if we go back to last year, the Biden administration elevated this fight against corruption to a national security issue. I mean, that's how, those are the words of our president, that if we don't do something to combat corruption, it's going to weaken our national security. You know, in the U.S., it's going to weaken the national security of our allies. So, you know, obviously it's a priority. It's not going away. And you know, although it's a relatively new tool, it still has, it's got a ton of support. And so everybody knows, it's administered dually by the Treasury Department and the State Department. So, you know, I'm a diplomat. I work for the State Department. This is you know, this is something that's done across agencies within the U.S. government. And Treasury Department, they do what's called the financial sanctions, where individuals can have their assets basically frozen that are, you know, that are sanctioned under global Magnitsky. And there's also visa restrictions, which the State Department would administer if somebody's you know, basically designated under Magnitsky for either human rights violation or a act of corruption. And so far, too, I think the numbers, you look at it, we've definitely, you know, this has been used heavily in the last several years. There's been over 400 individuals and organizations designated, and that's been in over 30 countries. And it's basically, you know, every region, too. I mean, this is not just focused on one region of the world. We're talking Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, Central America, North America. I mean, it's been, you know, this has been used all over the world so far.
Okay, so let me get you right. The whole process of the Magnitsky Act, you said, started in 2012.
Exactly.
And it was basically targeted at corrupt Russian government officials. That was the intent.
And human rights
and
violators.
human rights
Yep.
violators.
Yep.
Until 2017, when the Trump administration decided to extend it, to say, wait a minute, we gotta go across other countries. And you say it's effective more than 400 individuals and countries and organizations. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Now, what do you look up for? How does one get affected by this act?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You mean once somebody's been designated, basically, what are the...
No, I mean, before you designate the president, what do you look for? I mean, how do you start the process of investigating who is a corrupt president? How do you draw interest in the first place?
Right. Yeah, well, let me spell out, I think it's worth spelling out, like, what is a, let's just start with human rights abuse and kind of what does that look like? I mean, it includes things like extrajudicial killings, torture, degrading treatment or punishment, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearance. So that's a human rights violation. I mean, that's a pretty set standard. I think you'll see that globally. When you look at corruption, what does that basically mean? I mean, there's several things, but we're really looking at, you're looking, under Global Magnitsky at least, you're looking at, former or current government officials. They've basically done things like bribery, misappropriated state assets, expropriated private assets for personal gain, transferred assets of the state to their own for their own selfish needs. So there's various things that fall under that that fall into those definitions of corruption and human rights abuses. So that's kind of where you start with that. And just too, so people know, I mean, Global Magnitsky, a nomination package for this, it can start in various areas. I mean, it could start with a civil society group. It could start with a with a government entity within the U.S. It could start with a private citizen that has found something too. So it's a large encompassing process when it comes to where does the information come from. I mean, it can come from a lot of different areas, and clearly, this is quite a rigorous process, and it's an interagency process, and it's a process that's not taken lightly, and it's not done hastily either. I mean, it takes lots of time to gather sufficient information for Treasury to make a decision, particularly on the financial asset aspect, and then for the State Department to do visa restrictions. So it's not taken lightly for sure.
So let me rephrase the question, because I mean, the fact that you are here for me is an opportunity for the entire country. Now, when do you, as a government or the State Department or the Treasury, when do you gain interest in beginning to investigate Clarence Jackson, for example? Do you wait for, a complaint? Do you wait for somebody from my country to complain me as a corrupt person? Do you wait for an organization to complain me? To whom do they complain? What do you do next?
Clarence, let me step in here for a sec, because this is a great question, because a lot of people probably think, well, corruption, I mean, it's been around, it exists, and this is true. Corruption exists in the United States. It's not only a Liberian problem. It's not only a Russian problem, for instance. And we see it all around the world, and these designations are part of that. But Global Magnitsky is not meant to replace or to even be instead of a sovereign nation's justice system, right? So true accountability for any corrupt acts, those need to happen within the country, right? So a jury trial or an indictment or anything like that, that would happen, of course, through the justice system of any country. So the Global Magnitsky Act is not meant to replace any of those processes. And it's also, I think, important to note that while this act does focus on human rights violations as well as corruption, on the corruption side, very, very importantly, it's not just blatant corruption that would spur a designation. It's the undermining of democracy. So corruption within public officials that through that process, through stealing, right, public funding from taxpayers, from the public, it then undermines democracies. That's really important. So it's going after probably the most blatant cases. So in the hypothetical situation you just mentioned about, yourself, I mean, of course, Liberia has laws that are against corruption, and perhaps a private citizen might be indicted under those laws, but the U.S. government wouldn't be looking at a private citizen necessarily. The focus on corruption is typically, former or current public officials that are undermining democracy through that corruption.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just follow up on that because Sean hit the nail on the head. But if you look at the executive order, the presidential executive order that spurred global Magnitsky, I mean, it says, I'm reading it right here.
Yeah.
EO declares a national emergency with respect to serious human rights abuses and corruption globally, identifying these issues as threats to national security, foreign policy, and the economy of the United States. So you can kind of that's the order from the president that set this up. So things that are affecting U.S. national security, foreign policy, and our economy. Those are key issues that would lead to a potential global Magnitsky designation.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me ask you a question this way again, and I still need some clarity here, Sean. Unfortunately, now I'm an official of the Liberian government. I woke up tomorrow morning and I listened to Ambassador Michael McCurry in a press conference announcing my name as being sanctioned on the Global Magnitsky Act for corruption. The first thing that's running to my mind, how? I mean, who told these people that I'm corrupt? I know in the press conference the ambassador talked about a lot of things that they've done X, Y, and Z and X, Y, and Z. So my question is, do you just sit at the embassy and listen to radio stations and newspapers in Liberia and civil society people in Liberia that inform the decision as to who to sanction or not? Do you do your own internal investigation? Do you collaborate with the government of Liberia to investigate, to authenticate as to how do you do it? That's the question.
Well, let me start and just say that the process itself, this is not taken lightly, right? These decisions, as my colleague Kemper mentioned before, they go through a very rigorous, what we call an interagency process. So this is not just State Department, it's Treasury, it could be police and others. Just recently, you see that there's quite a bit of cooperation around the world on many different matters. And so, and I think you mentioned something important, that a free press is also extremely important because journalists play a key role in holding officials accountable. And of course, reading and listening to the press is important. Now, like any police or any sort of matter where an investigation, certain methods are not going to be discussed, right? I mean, it's important that the way that these designations are made, this is an interagency, a rigorous process. And when it goes through, let's just say that evidence is extremely important. These decisions are not taken lightly.
Yeah. And
Kemper, you want to jump on that?
I add a couple things too about nominations and kind of the way it works. The process for global Magnitsky, it's not punitive in nature. It's meant to disrupt activity that again affects national security, affects the economy of the U.S. But it's meant to change that behavior too. And the way that global Magnitsky, again, particularly Treasury, when they look at these things, they're looking at activities that are kind of ongoing within recent time. We're talking a few years that are affecting these issues. So that's the kind of stuff they're looking at. They're not going to go back 20 years with, at least with global Magnitsky, and say this activity was in this realm of corruption, because that's, if it's not currently ongoing, global Magnitsky is not really applied to that. So that's a key thing. And then it has to be specifics too. I mean, if there's information out there that's very speculative of if people on the street are just saying so and so is corrupt, well, why? Just because everybody says they're corrupt? Well, that's not specific. So they, again, as Sean said, in this process, there has to be very specific acts, and being able to have strong evidence on that. So it, and then credible too. I mean, sources have to be credible. It again, it's not going to just be somebody on the street said something. It has to be somebody that has some information on that can speak credibly to that. So those are just a little bit of insights into how Treasury in particular goes about this process. But again, as Sean said, it's an interagency process. There's a lot of entities within the U.S. government. There's a lot of entities within the Liberian government, any government, obviously. So it's not like there's just one input that's doing all of this. I mean, this is a joint process. That's how we process things as a government too.
Okay.
Yep.
How do you gather evidence? Intelligence, rather. How do you gather intelligence to inform the decision?
Well, one thing just if I can, because I want to continue making a point about what the global Magnitsky is not, right? It's not a replacement for a sovereign nation's
domestic
justice
laws.
system. Correct. It is not. And fundamentally, right, and we're here and we represent the United States. Of course, we are standing with Liberians. I think Liberians agree that standing up against corruption is a good thing. I think that people around the world agree that corruption undermines public trust and it undermines security. But fundamentally, when we're looking at global Magnitsky, this is also protecting our own national security. We do not want the United States or the United States financial system to be protecting or involved in helping corrupt actors overseas to launder their money or use their illegal assets and put that in the United States. So this is fundamentally it's not punitive in nature, as Kemper said. This is not meant to punish a government or punish a country, right? The sanctions are on individuals, and that and when the United States when there are U.S. citizens that are involved in corrupt acts overseas, then our court system will get involved. And we have various laws against people engaging in corruption overseas, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so any business that is in the United States that goes and invests and does work overseas, if they are engaged in corrupt acts, they will be under the laws of the United States. They can be arrested, their assets can be seized, etc. So
I just follow up on that point of Sean. So I think it's an important point about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act too. Again, I'm not a legal expert on that, but I will say, I have a business background, and if you're going to run a U.S. business, particularly one that's going to operate outside of U.S. borders, you do have to be very aware of that and understand that the standard's very clear for a U.S. business that corruption's not going to be tolerated, and you'll be prosecuted in the U.S. if you do that overseas. So if a U.S. company is looking at where can I invest my money and get a good return and do it cleanly too. Obviously, that's what the law is meant to incentivize. They're going to be very careful with any country in the world that they invest in, because they know that's the standard. It's a very set standard. So companies, they're going to make those decisions. They're going to evaluate, where am I going to put my money based on, obviously, that act alone is going to push that decision in a lot of ways. And that's what we want, as a U.S. government, as U.S. people, we want to incentivize that behavior, right? We don't want overseas actors incentivizing corrupt acts in the U.S. or illicit money in the U.S., and we also don't want U.S. actors, prone to do that kind of stuff in other countries too. So to us, it's like a win-win. That's why we do it.
Yeah. Okay. So another thing, what's in the act in the context of what the accused is usually contacted to say, hey, we heard this, we got evidence on you on this. I mean, what is it? Do you hear from the accuser? Is there anything in the act that provides due process?
Well, let me go back to what I stated before.
I know. You're talking about domestic laws.
Exactly.
Will always be respected.
Yeah.
So that's it continues. I know you're not going to say, well, we're prosecuting you because there are laws on Liberian books about that. So, but my question is, do these people know? Do you at any point contact them for questions or what?
So, global Magnitsky, as you just said, is not a prosecution, right? It is not in a court of law, and it is not the United States trying to step in and usurp any sovereign states from their own criminal procedures. And so in a democracy like Liberia, there are many mechanisms for citizens to hold officials accountable and to counter corruption. And so that's important to note.
How long does it take one to get affected from this process? How long does it take, the Treasury or State Department or the interagency in the U.S. to investigate a particular subject to come up with a decision?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, there's, again, it depends. I mean, that's the real answer. Like it really, but we're talking, months to years to build a package on a global, Magnitsky designation. Again, it's not a decision that can be taken very quickly.
However, it's worth saying that when a designation is made, when it's publicly announced, that's when the effects of the sanctions go in place. And remember, these sanctions, this is the U.S. seizing any assets that may be in the U.S. financial system and also imposing visa restrictions. So it is not, again, a replacement for I think you've used the words due process, right? Due process has to do with a court of law. Due process has to do with a criminal prosecution.
I know that.
And so that's why it's important for listeners to know that Global Magnitsky is not a criminal
Let's talk
prosecution.
about the impact on the destiny. Yeah, well, let's talk about it. What's the impact after these sanctions are announced? What do you look out for people who've been, designated by the Magnitsky Act?
So, on the financial sanction piece of it, the individual's assets that are in U.S. banking system, U.S. jurisdiction, will basically be frozen at that point. So they're not allowed, they will not be allowed to access those assets while they're designated under Global Magnitsky. On the visa restriction side, they're not going to be able to travel, to the U.S. They won't be able to get a visa, and their immediate family members also will be affected by that too, for visa restrictions. So, yeah, and as Sean said, that's once somebody's designated, I mean, those restrictions and sanctions take place, immediately. So it's that can be done obviously very quickly once a decision has been made by our government.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing to note on that is, again, the idea behind this act is to incentivize a change in behavior.
Okay.
Right? So again, even though I think a lot of listeners will hear what's just been said and think that this is, punishment, but the whole idea behind this is to help prompt change in behavior, right? We all want to see a Liberia that is free of corruption and that is allowing its citizens, to engage in a democratic process to really grow and fulfill the potential of this amazing country.
Is there any process by which a designee can be removed from the sanction? Is there any process?
Yeah, it's called delisting. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is, again, as the process is set out by Treasury on their side, it is meant to see rehabilitation in individuals. So yes, of course, if an individual wants to be considered delisting, there's a legal avenue to do that. There's an avenue where they can approach Treasury and present information to show that change. So, but again, we're talking legitimate change too. I mean, this is not like I instead of taking X amount of money, I only take this amount now. I mean, it's a legitimate. I have changed. I've seen the error of my ways, and I'm trying to actually make things right now, and be a positive force for change. Because that's the whole point, right? I mean, it's we don't want surface level change. I mean, we want really internal change in individuals to buy into this and realize for the greater good of everyone in Liberia, everyone in the U.S. We need to fight corruption together because it's not helping the country overall. Maybe a few people are benefiting from it, but overall, for the greater good of the country, it is painful. And
how long would that kind of change take, for example? Sean? How long would that kind of change take? I hear you talking about being real to get delisted. It's not just lips. You have to justify. You have to prove to State Department or Treasury that yes, I'm a changed person in my behavior. How long would that take?
I think I'm going to give a somewhat unsatisfactory answer because it depends. And just like the designation, I think that, I will say that it would take some effort on the part of those individuals to, to be delisted.
Okay.
And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So please clear this one. There's a rumor that goes around that when you are placed under the sanction as part of this Global Magnitsky Act, the U.S. government does not only look for resources probably that you're keeping in America, but they talk to partners around the world also to see whether you're also keeping these resources in some of the other countries, and there are probability that the U.S. government could communicate. Say, for example, you're keeping your money in Russia, you're keeping it in Switzerland, other places, and you are being designated. So American government, is it possible that under the act you can communicate with any other country to say, hey, Clarence was designated in Liberia, but we are hearing that he got some fat bank account in your country. Can you please check and verify? And if that is true, what do you do?
So yeah, I mean, I will say that when Treasury sends that information out that these individuals are now designated under Global Magnitsky, banks worldwide are notified, and they know that there's possible, if you're going to facilitate this person who's been designated, you're going to facilitate their activities, then there's potential ramifications for that, which could even be sanctions on people helping facilitate that activity. So yeah, I mean, there is consequences to trying to, if we've made this designation, clearly we want other partners too to look at that activity and obviously come along with us if they deem it as corrupt activity. But for sure, yeah, it has ramifications. I mean, that's how Magnitsky works.
Okay.
And I think it's worth mentioning that, and this is something that Kemper said at the beginning of the interview, that of course we're talking about the United States passage of the Global Magnitsky Act in 2017, but the effect of, when we talked about the history here, this had an effect worldwide, and there were many partners that also implemented their own version of a Magnitsky Act. And so, of course, just like when we're cooperating with other countries on law enforcement issues, or or making sure that human rights abusers or others are held to account in issues like this, we share information with partners, and those partners can also make decisions.
Okay.
Like
So
what you said.
okay. All right. Now, I'm designated under the Global Magnitsky Act. I'm a Liberian government official. I will always set the example on me. I'm designated. I mean, I'm also placed on visa restriction. Does that affect my wife and my kids in the event they wanted to go to the U.S.?
Yes, it does. The visa restrictions do apply to immediate family members.
It applies on your immediate family members.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you know them? How do you know them? I mean, there are many Jacksons in the country, for example. So Clarence Jackson is sanctioned, visa restriction. My wife goes to the embassy for visa. How do you know she's my wife? I mean, do you ask her that or what? How do you know?
Yeah, I mean, in general, we may not know, right? I mean, we can't know everything. I mean, there's plenty of relationships, yeah, that may be very difficult to find out. But the ones that we would know, maybe through past visa applications, and yeah, we would take action on that.
Okay, great. So the truth is, it will also affect my wife and my other family people. Now, this is a tough one, Sean, and I will look straight in your face and ask you, do we expect additional names in the coming weeks, months?
So of course, you're going to be unsatisfied again with my answer, but I'm glad that you asked the question. So, and Kemper can jump in if as the subject matter expert here. But the Global Magnitsky Act was just established 2017, right? We've had over 400 individuals or entities designated since then in that short time. The tool is not going away. All right, so
say that again.
The tool is not going away. So what does that mean? That means that, of course, we're not going to mention ahead of time if there are sanctions in the pipeline specifically for an individual or in any place. But
Meaning also that you are not erasing any possibility.
Correct.
And yeah, another thing to add to that too, just realize that this is one tool that the U.S. government has. There are other tools to battle corruption. I mean, there's lots of tools. I mean, if you look at our greater strategy to combat corruption, I mean, one of those is improving ties with partners and helping them strengthen. I mean, we've done that in Liberia. We're continuing to do that. We do that with partners all over the world. So it's just one tool. I mean, when you look at punitive or actions to actually stop corruption, I mean, there's other options too. There's visa restrictions themselves. There's 7031C is a visa restriction for corruption and human rights violators. So that's just one. I mean, there's also transnational criminal organization sanctions that can be put on traffickers. So Global Magnitsky, it does hold a lot of weight because it is a global thing, but the U.S. has other tools at our disposal to use, and we will use those tools. Our government will use them where we see appropriate, where it intersects with our foreign policy, where it intersects with protecting our national interests and affecting our national security. So yes, there's plenty of options. We clearly don't want to limit ourselves to how we want to combat corruption in the future.
Okay. Do you keep your eyes on these people? Do you just sanction and leave them? You don't care again? Do you continue to keep your eyes on them even though they are decimated?
Well, I would say, obviously there's a vested interest, and just going back to the point that these sanctions are meant to incentivize change, right? And to reemphasize the point, they're not a replacement for true accountability. So I would say, if you are a normal citizen in X country, and someone has been sanctioned by the U.S. government, those have certain consequences, of course. Especially in the United States, if there's assets or visa travel restrictions. But if there is true accountability to be had, then citizens of that country or that country's government could prosecute that individual and give that individual due process through the justice system and hold them to account. So true accountability is only going to be had, for instance, in Liberia. It can only come from Liberians themselves.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're hosting 2 U.S. Embassy officials. We're discussing the Global Magnitsky Act. Several facts. Fact number 1, that the Global Magnitsky Act came to being in 2012, and it was originally targeted at corrupt Russian officials and those associated with human rights violation. However, the administration of former President Donald Trump in 2017 decided to look at the law to extend it to have an international scope. So at this point, it started to affect people outside of Russia and other places. It's affected more than 400 individuals and others around the world, not just Liberia alone. So they're saying, for example, that when you sanction under the Global Magnitsky Act, and you are, visa restriction is placed on you, that is applicable to your wife and your kids. They are very clear about that. Ask them as to whether there is any possibility. They are not erasing any possibility of additional sanctions under the Act and other alternatives available to them. They are also saying they can't say anything ahead of time, but they are not erasing any possibility. But they are also saying this thing is not about, it's about changing behavior, because they believe corruption hurts, it undermines society, and anything that undermines the national security interests of the U.S. is their concern. So you're hearing all of these things. That is the reason why they are here. So it is not just about Liberian government officials alone. They are saying before this day, others have been affected before under the same Global Magnitsky Act. What are the takeaways? Call us on 0777. We can take 5 calls and then we'll go right back to them. 0777 700-995, 0770-942-817. If you're in the US and other places, our message is on, our numbers are on WhatsApp. You can call us. Let's go here. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah?
My name is Clarence calling from Virgin Street.
Yeah? Mhm. Okay. He's asking whether the act, under the act, former Liberian government officials could also be hope. Yeah. Let's go here and get you. Hello. Good morning. Okay, Fofana. Okay. Thank you. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. My name is Amos Williams, and I call from Monrovia.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing their thoughts and opinion on what is the interpretation for those who have been sanctioned wanting to contest the upcoming general elections.
Okay. The caller wants to know what's your opinion about the people who are being sanctioned in the event they want to contest in 2017. Hello?
Morning, Clarence.
Yeah.
My name is Bila B. Suarez, and I joined you this morning from my district resident.
Mm-hmm.
And let me appreciate them in attendance for your appreciation by coming to the public to advance some education on this complicated Magnitsky Act.
Yeah.
My question to them, I listened to them, but I didn't overheard it. I tend to be corrected. So which law that the global Magnitsky Act is going against a government official, a group of people?
You said which law?
Which law it can be revoked or reconsidered? Whether the international law or our country law?
Okay. Let me take the final call. Hello?
Good morning, Clarence.
Yeah, a few seconds, Chief.
Good morning to our partner. My name is Focus Portion. I call you from Monrovia.
Mm-hmm.
Clarence, I think I had two concerns. One has to do with the possibility for a destiny to challenge the sanction.
The possibility for a designee to challenge the sanction.
Challenge the sanction. The second thing is whether this Magnitsky Act is cover countries that are other.
Oh, you left the line. I didn't cut you off. You left the line. Let me lead them to answer. But Sean, let me ask you this question. In terms of prosecution, in the event the government of Liberia wanted to prosecute on the strength of the sanction, is the United States government, willing? Will you be willing to aid the government with evidence? Let's hear. Yes, yes.
So I think we had a number of questions come in. And,
Yeah, go ahead.
And if we want to address some of those, so I do appreciate
Go ahead.
the callers.
Go ahead.
And so just a couple points that I'll make, and I'll turn it over to Kemper. Just for callers' information, these designations, they come from a law that was passed in the United States, and so this is not under international law or any other country's law. So the designations, Global Magnitsky Act of 2017, this is under U.S. law. My colleague mentioned before there is a process for delisting, but again, this is not a criminal prosecution. This is not a criminal procedure. It's not a court of law, but there is a procedure in place if people do want to contest, the designation. In terms, I'll just briefly address the election question, because again, as a sovereign nation and as a democracy, Liberia makes its own decisions about, who is eligible to run in elections. The United States does not have any say in that process. So these designations, Global Magnitsky, don't have anything to do with elections. And then I think there was that last question that got cut off. It may have been having to do with, does this affect other countries? Just by the title alone, Global Magnitsky, yes. This has been used all over the world, I think on every continent, and in over 30 different countries, officials have been designated. Was there any other point, Kemper, that you wanted to make?
No, I think Sean covered actually quite a few of the points. Honestly, I mean, one thing I will mention on. I think one of the callers talked about why does it seem that some Liberian officials flee to the U.S. if they have problems. Again, we have a judicial system in the U.S. just like Liberia does. We have the Department of Justice, and if someone is in U.S. jurisdiction and someone is a U.S. citizen, they can face prosecution in the U.S. for corrupt acts. So clearly there's means to deal with that behavior too.
And one thing I'll say on top of that is that we have an immigration process as well, and people have been prosecuted on immigration violations for crimes, perhaps crimes against humanity or other human rights abuses, for instance, that have been committed, not in the jurisdiction of the United States, but if they later immigrate and they lie about what they've done on their immigration form, they can be prosecuted for that as well. So, so there are tools, and no system is perfect, of course. So I think that that's important to note. But the purpose of Global Magnitsky, I'll say again, it's not a punitive measure. It's on individuals, not on a country, not on any particular government. And it's important to say that this is part of our core national security priorities. And President Biden, when he established corruption as a core national security interest, he said, corruption threatens the United States national security. It threatens our economic equity, global anti-poverty and development efforts, and democracy itself.
Okay, Sean. Thanks to both of you for coming. But my last question, I was also asking as to whether in the event Liberia wanted to prosecute these officials who have been sanctioned, is there any way possible for the U.S. to help with evidence against them?
Well, in terms of any criminal investigation here, that's of course in the hands of the justice system in Liberia. I would not rule out. I think we cooperate quite with governments all over the world in many different ways between our justice system and their justice system. So I'll leave it at that. But I'll say that we do cooperate with governments all around the world.
And various governments do have different kind of signed mutual agreements too with the U.S. So it's case by case and kind of what can be shared and how to what levels too. So again, Sean and I, neither one of us are legal experts, so I won't go into too much of that. But
I know.
but I do think in general, of course, I think the U.S. will try to work with a partner as much as we can.
Yes.
Okay. Sean, is there anything we didn't talk about you want to say before we can let you go?
I just want to say again, what a pleasure it is to be able to speak with you today. Just to give a slight preview, I know that we'll be back with a special guest.
Yeah, on Friday.
On Friday.
Yeah.
So we're excited to do that and to speak to your listeners. And I think just again the point of a free press, asking hard questions, asking important questions. And we're happy to be here to speak to your audience and do the best we can to inform and talk about this important Global Magnitsky Act. Thanks for inviting us on.
And I just wanted to add too, I did a similar chat a few weeks back with NAMOT at their forum on democracy, and a lot of young Liberians were there. I was very, very impressed.
I saw a picture of you in lecture.
Yeah, I was very impressed with just the level of questioning. I mean, just like we had, I think, today in this interaction, but you can tell that Liberians are really thinking through these issues at very deep levels, which I think shows that there's obviously a big interest, but there's also I think a big care factor for Liberians to get Liberia in a place where it can be in a place where it does benefit the overall good, and that corruption is maybe a much lesser problem in the overall scope of issues. So I think that's a great sign to show that Liberia's youth all the way through are interested in this topic, and I think that's where we're going to see, in the future for Liberia, where some really strong change will come from is the engagement that we see through CSOs and other organizations that are working in this area. But we're, again, my hat's off to just the questioning and the level of thought that I've seen so far on this issue. We owe it to Liberians to try to at least give some background so that dialogue can continue.
Sean and your colleague, thank you so much for coming. At least you've provided sufficiency in terms of educating our population about the Global Magnitsky Act and what it is, who it affects, and I'm sure everything about it. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hope to see you on Friday again when you come here with one of your government officials.
Wonderful, and happy to come on anytime. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, folks. This is how we draw down the curtains on this presentation of the OK Morning Rush. So you heard about the Global Magnitsky Act. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. It was established in 2012, and then they looked at it in 2017 to give it a global mandate. At the moment, more than 400 persons from around the world have been affected, not just in Liberia. And they say the way it is done, when you are designated as part of the Global Magnitsky Act, your immediate family members, your wife and your kids will not have U.S. visa because you were placed on visa restriction also. They say, no, they do not have anything definitely to say about whether these people contest in elections or not because it is a Liberian process. And they're also saying the act is not in any way undermining any laws in Liberia because all of the laws are constant. It's not going to touch anything. They say it's not about punishment, but it's about change in behavior. My name is Clarence Jackson. God's willing, tomorrow morning I'll be back here. Thanks to Robert Clark and all of his bosses at the U.S. Embassy for always making it happen. Boda, thank you so much. Bye-bye. In the midst of all this, let's keep peace in Liberia.